My father demands I pay off his mortgage because sons take care of parents after he abandoned us and started a new family. I was standing in my driveway at 11:37 a.m. on a Saturday morning, staring at a man I barely recognized as my father, listening to him explain with complete sincerity that I owed him $183,000 to pay off the mortgage on his house because that's what good sons do for their parents. Richard, my father, the man who'd walked out when I was 7 years old and built an entirely new family 2 states away, was leaning against a silver Nissan Altima with his arms crossed, his face set in that expression of reasonable expectation, like he'd just asked me to help move furniture or lend him $20. Behind him in the passenger seat, I could see his wife Pamela scrolling through her phone, and in the back, their teenage daughter Leah was wearing headphones, completely disengaged from this conversation. My hands were gripping my car keys so tightly the metal edges were cutting into my palm, and I felt this surreal disconnect, like surely I'd misheard. Surely he hadn't just driven 4 hours to my house to demand I liquidate a significant portion of my savings to cover his financial mistakes because of some twisted interpretation of filial duty. But the manila folder in his hand, the one he kept gesturing with as he explained the mortgage details and payment schedule, told me this was absolutely real and he was absolutely serious. I'd been living a quiet, stable life for my 32 years when that moment arrived, building a career as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company, buying my own modest house 3 years prior, managing my finances carefully the way my mother had taught me after Richard left us with nothing. My mom, Claire, had raised me and my younger sister, Jenna, essentially as a single parent from the time I was 7 and she was 4, working 2 jobs for years until she could get her nursing degree, teaching us about budgeting and saving and never depending on anyone else for our financial security. Richard had left on a random Thursday in March when I was in 2nd grade, said he was going to pick up groceries and just never came back. We found out later through his brother that he'd moved to Arizona, met someone new, and decided his old life wasn't working for him anymore. No custody arrangement, no child support, no contact. Just gone. He'd sent exactly 3 birthday cards over the next 25 years, generic ones with impersonal messages signed just Dad, like he was some distant relative performing a social obligation. The last time I'd seen Richard in person was at my college graduation, 11 years ago. He'd shown up unannounced with Pamela and their 2 kids, Austin and Leah, who were maybe 8 and 6 at the time. It had been awkward and strange, him introducing me to his other family like we were all just one big, happy, extended clan, rather than him being a man who'd abandoned his first family and built a replacement. He'd taken me to lunch after the ceremony, just the 2 of us, and spent the entire meal talking about his life in Arizona, his job in sales, his kids' activities, barely asking about my degree or plans. When the check came, I'd paid it because he'd made some comment about cash being tight with 2 kids in sports. That lunch had cost me $63, and I remembered feeling angry at myself for paying but unable to figure out how to refuse without causing a scene. Now, standing in my driveway with him demanding nearly $200,000, that $63 lunch felt like a warning sign I should have heeded. Richard was explaining that he and Pamela had refinanced their house 3 years ago to pay for some investments that hadn't worked out, and now they were struggling with the monthly payments. He said he'd thought about his options and realized he had a son who was doing well financially, who had a good job and a house, and in traditional family values, sons took care of their aging parents. He was 58, hardly aging, and I'd been taking care of myself since he walked out when I was 7, but apparently none of that mattered because biology created obligation in his mind. I asked him if he was serious, if he genuinely expected me to hand over nearly $200,000. He said hand over was a harsh way to phrase it, that he was asking for help from family, and maybe we could work out a payment plan if I couldn't do it all at once. I felt this laugh bubble up, slightly hysterical, and asked what he'd contributed to my life that would make him think I owed him anything. His expression shifted to injured surprise, and he said he was my father. That should be enough. I said he was my father biologically, but he'd abandoned that role when I was 7, had built a new family, had been completely absent for 25 years, except for 3 birthday cards and 1 awkward lunch. Richard said that was my mother's bitterness talking, that there were 2 sides to every story, that he'd tried to maintain contact, but Claire had made it difficult. That lie, delivered so casually, made my vision actually blur with rage for a second. My mother had never prevented contact, had never said a negative word about Richard in front of us, despite having every reason to, had left the door open for him to be involved if he chose to be. He'd chosen not to be. I told him that was a lie, that Mom had never interfered, that he'd simply decided his new family was more important than his old one. Richard's face hardened, and he said I didn't know what I was talking about, that adult relationships were complicated, and this conversation was about his current need for help, not rehashing ancient history. I told him to leave. He looked genuinely shocked, said I wasn't even going to consider it, wasn't going to hear him out about the details. I said there were no details that would change my answer, that I didn't owe him money or time or consideration. He said I was being selfish, that family helped family, that when I had kids someday, I'd understand. I said if I had kids, I wouldn't abandon them, and then show up decades later demanding they fund my mistakes. So no, I probably wouldn't understand. Pamela got out of the car then, and I braced myself for her involvement. She said we should all calm down, that surely we could discuss this reasonably. I asked if she understood that her husband was asking me to pay off their mortgage despite having no relationship with me. She said Richard had been struggling with how to reconnect with his first family, that this was his way of reaching out, and maybe helping each other financially could rebuild the relationship. The logic was so backwards and manipulative, I actually laughed. I said rebuilding a relationship generally started with apologies and effort, not financial demands. Richard said he'd apologize if that's what I needed to hear, that he was sorry for not being more present, and now could we talk about the mortgage? The apology was so perfunctory and transactional, it meant less than nothing. I told them both to leave my property, or I'd call the police for trespassing. Richard's expression went cold, and he said I'd regret this, that he'd tried to handle it privately, but there were other options. I asked what that meant, and he said family had ways of making sure obligations were met, that I might find my reputation affected if people knew how I'd treated my struggling father. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I told him to do whatever he wanted, that I wasn't paying him a single dollar, and to never contact me again. He got back in the car, Pamela following, and they drove away. I stood in my driveway for a long time after, trying to process what had just happened. Then I went inside and called my mom. She answered on the second ring, cheerful and relaxed on her Saturday morning, and I told her Richard had just showed up demanding I pay off his mortgage. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then she asked if I was joking. I said I wished I was, and told her the whole story. She was quiet again, then said that was beyond anything she'd imagined even from him, that she was sorry I'd had to deal with that, and asked if I was okay. I said I was angry but okay, and asked if she knew anything about his financial situation. She said she'd heard through Richard's brother Frank about a year ago that Richard and Pamela had gotten into some kind of investment scam, lost a lot of money, but she didn't know details. I asked why she hadn't mentioned it. She said she didn't think it was relevant to our lives, that Richard's choices and consequences weren't our concern anymore. I said apparently he thought they were my concern now. She told me to block his number, ignore any further contact, and not to feel guilty for a second. I said I didn't feel guilty, I felt furious. She said that was appropriate, and to call her if he bothered me again. I thought that would be the end of it, that Richard would slink back to Arizona embarrassed, and that would be that. I was wrong. 3 days later, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize with the subject line, family obligation and financial support. The email was from Richard, using what I assumed was a new email address since I'd blocked his previous one. It was long, detailed, and meticulously crafted to sound reasonable. He apologized for ambushing me at my house, said he'd been stressed and hadn't approached things correctly. He explained his financial situation, the refinancing of his house, an investment opportunity that had turned out to be fraudulent, legal fees trying to recover the money, medical expenses for Pamela's mother who'd been ill, Austin's college tuition. He said he wasn't asking for charity, he was asking for a loan with interest, that we could formalize it legally, that he'd pay me back over time. The email ended with a paragraph about family bonds, about how he knew he hadn't been the father he should have been, but he was trying now, and part of trying meant being honest about needing help. He said he'd looked into my career and knew I was doing well, that this amount wouldn't devastate me the way it would devastate him and his family to lose their house. He said Leah was only 15 and didn't deserve to be uprooted because of adult mistakes, and as her older brother, I had an opportunity to protect her. The manipulation was sophisticated, layered, hitting emotional buttons while maintaining plausible deniability. I didn't respond to the email, but I didn't delete it either. Something about the calculated nature of it made me want to document this. I forwarded it to my personal backup email and saved it in a folder. Then I called Jenna, my sister, who was 29 and working as a teacher in Oregon. I asked if Richard had contacted her. She said no. Why? I told her about the driveway confrontation and the email. Jenna was silent for a moment, then said, Jesus, he's actually insane. I asked if she'd heard anything from him over the years. She said she'd gotten the same 3 birthday cards I had, nothing else. She asked what I was going to do. I said, ignore it, and hope he went away. She said, fat chance, people who show up demanding money don't just go away. She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard sent 4 more emails, each one slightly more desperate and slightly more manipulative. He mentioned my late grandfather, his father, who apparently would have been disappointed to see family not helping family. He brought up hypothetical future scenarios where I might need help and would want family to be there. He sent photos of his house, a nice suburban place with a well-maintained yard, with captions about how hard they'd worked to build this life and how devastating it would be to lose it. He sent a photo of Leah at her quinceañera, all dressed up and smiling, with a message about protecting her stability and future. Each email I saved without responding, building a file of his escalating manipulation. Then he switched tactics. I got a friend request on Facebook from Austin, Richard's son, my half-brother who I'd met exactly once at my graduation. I didn't accept it, but I could see his profile photo and recent posts. He'd posted something about family being the most important thing, about supporting each other through hard times, with several comments from people agreeing. It felt targeted, like Richard had orchestrated it. 2 days later, Pamela sent me a Facebook message saying she was sorry to bother me, but she was a mother trying to protect her children, and would I please at least consider a smaller amount, maybe $50,000, just enough to help them restructure their debt and avoid foreclosure. I showed all of this to my girlfriend Zoe, who I'd been dating for almost 2 years. She was a paralegal at a law firm, practical and sharp, and she immediately said I needed to talk to a lawyer. I said about what? It's not illegal for him to ask for money. She said the escalating contact, the involvement of multiple family members, the implied threats about my reputation, all of that together could constitute harassment, and I needed professional advice on how to handle it. She gave me the name of an attorney at her firm who specialized in family law and personal disputes, a woman named Diana Oakes, who had 23 years of experience. I called Diana's office on a Monday and got an appointment for Wednesday afternoon. When I met with her, I brought printouts of all Richard's emails, screenshots of the Facebook messages and friend request, a written timeline of events starting with the driveway confrontation. Diana reviewed everything carefully, taking notes, asking questions about my history with Richard and whether there'd ever been any financial support in either direction. I told her about the 0 child support, the 3 birthday cards in 25 years, the 1 lunch I'd paid for at my graduation. She asked if I had any legal documentation about the lack of child support. I said my mom probably did. Diana explained that while Richard asking for money wasn't illegal, some of his tactics could potentially constitute harassment if they continued to escalate, especially the reputation threats. She recommended I send a formal cease and desist letter, drafted by her, stating that I would not be providing any financial assistance and all future contact should stop. She said if he persisted after receiving that letter, we'd have grounds to pursue a restraining order or harassment charges. She also recommended I document any financial records showing my independence and lack of support from him, in case he tried to make some legal claim of obligation, though she said such a claim would have no legal merit in our state. The cease and desist letter went out via certified mail on Friday. Richard signed for it the following Monday, according to the tracking. I thought that would finally end it. Instead, it seemed to enrage him. On Wednesday, I got a voicemail at work from a number I didn't recognize. It was Richard, his voice tight with anger, saying I'd made a huge mistake involving lawyers, that he'd tried to handle this within the family, but now he'd handle it publicly. He said people should know what kind of son refuses to help his struggling father, that my company and colleagues would be interested to hear about my lack of family values. The threat was explicit enough to make my stomach drop. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Diana. She called me back within an hour and said this was exactly the escalation she'd been concerned about, that threatening my employment and reputation moved this into actionable territory. She said we could file for a restraining order based on harassment and threatening behavior, and she recommended we do so immediately. She also suggested I alert my HR department at work about the situation, just in case Richard followed through on his threat to contact them. That conversation was one of the hardest I'd had professionally. I scheduled a meeting with our HR director, a woman named Carol Simmons, who'd been with the company for 15 years, and explained that I had a family situation that might result in someone contacting the company with false information about me. I gave her the basics. Estranged father who'd abandoned the family decades ago was now demanding money and threatening to damage my reputation when I refused. Carol was sympathetic and professional, said she appreciated the heads up, and that any contact from external parties would be handled appropriately and wouldn't affect my standing with the company. She asked if I was safe, if there was any physical threat, and I said I didn't think so, but I was pursuing a restraining order to be safe. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. Diana filed the petition with all our documentation, the emails, the Facebook messages, the voicemail, my written account of the driveway confrontation, and a statement from Carol Simmons confirming I'd reported the threats to my employer. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Margaret Holloway, a woman in her late 50s known for being tough, but fair. Diana said we had a strong case given the threatening nature of Richard's contact and the fact that he'd ignored the cease and desist letter. Richard showed up to the hearing without a lawyer, which Diana said was a mistake on his part. He tried to represent himself, claiming he'd only been asking his son for help during a difficult time, that I'd overreacted by involving lawyers, that all of this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Judge Holloway asked him directly if he'd sent the emails presented as evidence. He said yes, but they were just asking for help. She asked if he'd left the voicemail threatening to contact my employer. He hesitated, then said he'd been upset and maybe had said things he shouldn't have, but he hadn't actually contacted my work, so there was no real harm done. Judge Holloway reviewed the cease and desist letter, noted that Richard had received it, and then made the threatening phone call anyway, and said that demonstrated clear disregard for legal boundaries and escalating harassment. She asked Richard if he understood that his son had no legal obligation to provide him with financial support. Richard said legal obligation and moral obligation were different things. Judge Holloway said moral obligations were not enforceable through harassment and threats. She granted a temporary restraining order prohibiting Richard from contacting me directly or through third parties, from coming within 500 feet of my home or workplace, and from posting about me on social media. The order would be in effect for 1 year, with a review at 6 months. Richard looked stunned. He started to argue, and Judge Holloway cut him off, said the order was final and violation would result in contempt charges. Richard left the courtroom looking furious, and I felt this weird combination of relief and anxiety. Diana said the restraining order was a good outcome, but I should remain vigilant, that people who felt entitled to other people's money sometimes didn't respect legal boundaries. For about 3 weeks, things were quiet. The restraining order seemed to have worked. Then I got a call from my mom, her voice shaking, saying Richard had shown up at her house. She lived 4 states away, The restraining order didn't cover her, and he'd apparently decided to go around me to get to the money. He'd told her that as my mother, she had influence over me, that she should convince me to help him because it was the right thing to do. When she'd told him to leave, he'd said she'd poisoned me against him, that she'd spent 25 years filling my head with lies about him abandoning us when the truth was more complicated. My mom had called the police to have him removed from her property, and they'd escorted him away with a warning about trespassing. I felt rage like I'd never experienced. He'd crossed a line going after my mom, the woman who'd raised us alone because he'd walked away. I called Diana immediately and asked what our options were. She said since the restraining order only covered me, my mom would need to file her own order in her state if she wanted legal protection. She also said Richard's escalating behavior, now including traveling across state lines to harass family members, could potentially support a more comprehensive legal strategy. She asked if I'd considered going public with his demands, exposing the situation to his community or family members who might not know what he was doing. I hadn't considered it, but the idea appealed to me. Diana cautioned that going public could backfire, could make me look vindictive, but it could also create social consequences for Richard that legal consequences hadn't. She said it was my choice, but to think carefully about the ramifications. I called my mom back and asked if she wanted to pursue a restraining order. She said she did, that she was tired of Richard causing problems, and she'd contact a local attorney. Then I asked her something I'd never asked before. If she had documentation of the child support he'd never paid. She said she had everything, had kept meticulous records because her lawyer during the divorce had told her to document everything. She'd filed for child support when Richard left, had been awarded a specific amount per month for both kids, and he'd paid exactly 4 months of payments before disappearing and never paying again. She'd tried to enforce it legally, but he'd moved states, claimed no income, made himself impossible to pursue without spending more on lawyers than she'd recover. The total unpaid child support over 18 years for 2 kids was approximately $168,000, not including interest and penalties. That number hit me like a physical blow. Richard owed our mother, $168,000, and he'd had the audacity to show up demanding I pay him $183,000. The hypocrisy was so staggering I actually felt dizzy. I asked my mom to send me all the documentation, the divorce decree, the child support order, the payment records showing the 4 payments, and then nothing for years. She said she would, and asked what I was planning. I said I wasn't sure yet, but I wanted to have all the facts. The documentation arrived via overnight mail 3 days later. I spent an evening going through it all, seeing in black and white the legal obligation Richard had ignored for decades. The divorce decree from 26 years ago, granting my mom sole custody and requiring Richard to pay $650 per month in child support for 2 children. The bank records showing 4 deposits of $650, then nothing. The letters from my mom's attorney trying to locate Richard and enforce payment. The responses from various state agencies saying he couldn't be located or had no income to garnish. The accumulation of debt year after year. By my calculation with basic interest, Richard owed closer to $240,000. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I took everything to Diana and asked what we could do with this information. She reviewed the documents and said the statute of limitations on child support enforcement varied by state, but many states allowed collection efforts to continue well into adulthood. She said my mom could potentially pursue the debt through the courts, though actually collecting might be difficult if Richard had no assets beyond his mortgaged house. I asked if there was any way to use this information defensively, to make sure Richard couldn't pursue any future claims against me. Diana said the unpaid child support definitively established that Richard had no moral or legal standing to claim I owed him anything, and we could use it if he violated the restraining order or escalated further. I also took the documents to a therapist, Dr. Leonard Weiss, a psychologist specializing in family trauma and estrangement, who my company's EAP program had connected me with. I'd started seeing him weekly after the restraining order hearing, trying to process the anger and confusion of Richard's reappearance in my life. Dr. Weiss helped me understand that Richard's demands were part of a narcissistic pattern, where he felt entitled to resources from others while never recognizing his own obligations. He said the fact that Richard owed massive unpaid child support while demanding I pay his mortgage was textbook narcissistic entitlement, an inability to see himself as having responsibilities, only rights. Dr. Weiss also helped me work through the guilt I was feeling, guilt that surprised me because I logically knew I owed Richard nothing, but emotionally still struggled with the societal messaging about family obligations. He helped me understand that obligation flows from relationship and care, not just biology, and that Richard had severed any claim to obligation when he abandoned us. He validated my decision to maintain boundaries and supported the restraining order as necessary protection. 6 weeks after my mom was harassed, I got a Facebook message from someone named Kelly Davidson, who identified herself as Richard's sister, my aunt, though I'd never met her. The message was long and carefully worded, expressing sympathy for the family rift, but saying she felt I should know that Richard and Pamela were genuinely facing foreclosure, that Austin had dropped out of college to work and help with finances, that Leah was showing signs of depression because of the family stress. Kelly said she understood I had complicated feelings about Richard, but asked me to consider the innocent people who would be hurt if their house was lost, specifically the kids. She said even a small amount would help, maybe $20,000 or $30,000, and she'd personally make sure Richard didn't bother me again if I'd just helped this once. The manipulation through a new person was sophisticated, but transparent. I screenshot the message and sent it to Diana, asking if this violated the restraining order since it was technically a third party contacting me. Diana said it was a gray area, that Kelly wasn't explicitly acting on Richard's behalf in the message, though it seemed likely he'd orchestrated it. She said I could respond once telling Kelly not to contact me about this issue, and if she persisted, we could add her to the restraining order. I sent Kelly a brief message saying I wouldn't be providing financial help and asking her not to contact me about this again. She responded immediately saying I was condemning my siblings to homelessness and I'd have to live with that. I blocked her and forwarded that message to Diana as well. The situation reached a crisis point 2 months after the restraining order was granted. I got a call from Jenna, panicked and crying, saying Richard had shown up at her school demanding to speak with her. She was in the middle of teaching, and the front office had called her saying a man claiming to be her father was insisting on seeing her. She'd had security escort him off campus and called the police, but she was shaken and scared. I told her to file a restraining order immediately, that he'd now harassed both her and Mom, and this was escalating dangerously. She said she would, and asked how far he was going to take this. I said I didn't know, but we needed to protect ourselves legally from every angle. That evening I made a decision. I created a detailed document outlining everything that had happened, including the unpaid child support, Richard's demands, the escalation of harassment, the restraining orders. I included scanned copies of the key documents, the child support order, the cease and desist letter, the restraining order, screenshots of messages. Then I sent it to Richard's brother Frank, the only member of Richard's family who'd stayed in occasional contact with my mom over the years and who'd always been decent to us. I explained that Richard had been harassing me, my mother, and my sister, demanding money while having never paid the child support he legally owed, and I wanted Frank to have the full picture of what was happening. Frank called me the next day, his voice tight with anger, but anger directed at Richard, not me. He said he'd known Richard had financial problems, but had no idea he'd been harassing us for money. He said he'd suspected Richard hadn't paid child support but didn't know the full extent. He asked if he could share my document with other family members, specifically Richard's other siblings, because he felt they should know what kind of person their brother had become. I said yes, that I was tired of protecting Richard's reputation while he destroyed mine. The family explosion that followed was swift and brutal. Within a week, I started getting messages from various relatives I'd never met. Richard's older sister Maureen reached out apologizing for Richard's behavior and saying she'd had no idea he'd abandoned his first family so completely. Richard's cousin David contacted me, saying he'd always thought Richard was a good guy, but this information changed everything. Several relatives expressed shock at the unpaid child support amount and said if they'd known they would have pressured Richard to fulfill his obligations. The family consensus turned sharply against Richard, and from what Frank told me, Richard was essentially being shunned from family events and facing intense criticism from his siblings. The social consequences apparently hit Richard hard. I heard through Frank that Richard and Pamela's marriage was under severe strain because Pamela hadn't known about the extent of the unpaid child support and felt lied to. Austin had apparently confronted his father about abandoning his older children, and their relationship was damaged. The house foreclosure proceeded because Richard couldn't secure help from anyone once the truth came out. They ended up short-selling the house and moving to a rental property, significantly downsizing their lifestyle. Richard made one final attempt to contact me, violating the restraining order by sending an email from yet another new account. The email was angry and bitter, blaming me for destroying his life, for turning his family against him, for costing him his house and his relationships. He said all of this because I couldn't show basic compassion and help when he needed it, that I'd rather see him suffer than be a decent son. The email was unhinged enough that Diana said we should forward it to the police and pursue contempt charges for the restraining order violation. The contempt hearing was brief. Judge Holloway reviewed the email, noted that it was a clear violation of the restraining order that explicitly prohibited all contact, and held Richard in contempt. She sentenced him to 30 days in county jail, with 15 days suspended contingent on him completing an anger management program and having no further violations. Richard served 15 days, and from what I heard through Frank, those 15 days broke something in him. He came out quieter, diminished, apparently finally understanding that his actions had real consequences. I never heard from Richard again after that. The restraining order remained in effect for the full year. Then I chose not to renew it because there'd been no contact, and I didn't want to keep expending energy on him. My mom and Jenna both obtained their own restraining orders after he harassed them, and those remained in place. The unpaid child support was never pursued in court because my mom decided, with the help of her own therapist, that she didn't want to spend years in legal battles trying to extract money from someone who'd already proven he'd do anything to avoid paying. She said the money wasn't worth the ongoing stress and involvement in Richard's life. I continued therapy with Dr. Weiss for another 8 months, working through the trauma of the whole experience and the complicated feelings about having a parent who viewed me purely as a resource to be exploited. He helped me understand that going public with the truth wasn't vindictive. It was protecting myself and establishing reality when someone was trying to manipulate narrative. He validated that I'd done the right thing at every step, maintaining boundaries, seeking legal protection, and refusing to enable Richard's sense of entitlement. Zoe and I got engaged about a year after the restraining order was granted. Richard was not invited to the wedding, and I felt zero guilt about it. My mom walked me down the aisle, the parent who'd actually raised me and deserved the honor. Jenna was my best woman, standing beside me as we'd stood beside each other through the chaos Richard had created. The wedding was beautiful, filled with people who'd actually been present in my life, and Richard's absence was noticeable only in its complete lack of impact on the day. I think about that Saturday morning in my driveway sometimes, about Richard leaning against his car explaining why I owed him nearly $200,000 like it was reasonable, like his abandonment and his unpaid child support and his decades of absence were all irrelevant compared to his current need. I think about how close I came to questioning myself, to wondering if maybe he was right, that family obligation meant something regardless of history. But I held my ground, documented everything, sought professional help, and let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was devastating to Richard in exactly the ways it should have been. The last I heard through Frank, Richard and Pamela eventually divorced, unable to recover from the financial stress and the revelation of Richard's past. Richard lives alone in a small apartment, working a sales job that barely covers his bills. Austin and Leah have minimal contact with him, having learned through the whole experience that their father was someone who abandoned obligations when they became inconvenient. The family that Richard thought he could leverage to extract money from me ended up being collateral damage in his own choices. I don't feel triumphant about his situation, but I don't feel guilty either. He built his life on a foundation of abandonment and entitlement, and when that foundation cracked under pressure, he tried to shift the burden to the son he'd discarded decades before. I refused to accept that burden, refused to pretend biology created obligation, divorced from care and presence, and the consequences were his to bear. My mom taught me that through her example of raising us alone, of building a life from nothing after Richard left. She taught me that you can't demand what you haven't earned, that you can't expect care from people you've harmed without repair and restitution. I paid off my own mortgage last year, 3 years early, using bonuses and careful financial planning. The house is mine, free and clear, built with my own labor and resources. Richard will likely never own a home again, having lost the one he tried to make me pay for. That's not my victory over him. It's just the natural outcome of our different choices. He chose abandonment, entitlement, and manipulation. I chose responsibility, boundaries, and self-sufficiency. We both live with the results of those choices. Sometimes people ask if I'd ever reconcile with Richard, ever give him another chance if he genuinely apologized and changed. I don't know the answer to that. The restraining order expired years ago, and he's made no attempt to contact me, which suggests either he's finally learned boundaries or he's simply given up. Either way, the door isn't open. He didn't just ask for money. He demonstrated through every action that he views me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be valued. That's not a relationship that can be repaired with apologies. My daughter was born 8 months ago, a beautiful girl named Claire after my mom. Richard doesn't know he has a granddaughter and never will unless circumstances dramatically change. She'll grow up knowing her grandmother Claire, her Aunt Jenna, and eventually knowing the full story of what happened with her biological grandfather. She'll understand that family is built through presence and care, not demanded through biology, and she'll never doubt that her parents will be there, consistently and reliably, because that's what parents do. Richard taught me one valuable lesson, exactly what kind of father not to be. He showed me through his absence and his entitlement and his manipulation that biology without relationship is meaningless, that you can't abandon your children and then demand they fund your mistakes. That lesson guides every parenting decision I make, every moment I choose presence over convenience, every time I prioritize my daughter's needs over my comfort. In that way, Richard contributed something to my life after all, though not in any way he intended or would recognize. He taught me by negative example, and I'm grateful for the clarity that provides. The man who showed up in my driveway demanding $183,000 while owing $168,000 in unpaid child support doesn't get to call himself a father in any meaningful sense. He's a biological donor who made choices for decades and then wanted to escape the consequences by exploiting the children he'd abandoned. I wouldn't pay his mortgage then, I wouldn't pay it now if he asked again, and I sleep perfectly well with that decision. The money I saved, the money he wanted, is building security for my actual family, the people who show up and stay and care. That's where it belongs. That's what it's for. And he has no claim to any of it, legal or moral. He never did. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.